or many biblical traditions say is the tribulation before the times of peace. Well, is this what we're being shown? Do we have to go through the bad times to get to the good times? Or could the prophets have been showing us something we're just beginning to understand? Could they have been standing in what the ancients called the rivers of time, or the roads, or the paths, or the waves, or the ribbons of time, rather than looking at a sequence of events? Maybe they were looking at an array of possibilities that range from the darkest of the dark to the lightest of the light. Does that make sense so far? A range of possibilities. If this is true, in the only language of their time, the ancients may have been saying something very, very different. All prophecies may be saying something very different. What Isaiah is saying, of the many things, and please, this is so brief and so high level, we are just barely scratching the surface of what I believe these texts are saying to us, and many other traditions are saying the same things. That we have, first of all, the ability to know, to glimpse into future consequences of choices that we make in the present. Secondly, we embody the power to choose which of those consequences we experience. How do you feel about that? How do you feel about that kind of power? Well, thank you. For some people, this is frightening, because for some people, that degree of power is overwhelming to them. They say, my God. And that's exactly right. My God. The question is, do we know how to choose? I believe we know precisely how to choose. What the Roman texts say to us is that when the Essenes disbanded in the first century after the crucifixion, they took these libraries with them. They hid the scrolls in the Dead Sea, above the caves of Qumran, and they were scattered across the face of the earth. And everywhere they went, they took their libraries with them. My reasoning in the spring of 1998, I said, if we were ever to find any of these texts, we will probably find the most intact texts in the place that has been least disturbed by modern civilization. And at that time, it was the highlands of today what we call central Tibet. In March of 98, I had the honor and the privilege of facilitating a 22-day pilgrimage in the 12 monasteries and 2 nunneries, and some of the most awesome, desolate, magnificent, beautiful, and frightening land that I've ever seen in my life. What we know is that the Tibetans are master record keepers. In addition to the Buddhist traditions of today and their native Bon, B-O-N traditions that were their practice before the Buddhist traditions, the Tibetans also have pre-Christian and Christian records in their monasteries that came with the Essenes, the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls, when they fled Qumran. And by the way, as a little aside, the records show that these same libraries traveled into Peru, into Bolivia, and into the American desert Southwest. And the Native Americans today have traditions of actually working with the Essenes, the Hopi and the Navajo and the Lakota Sioux, to understand what these traditions are saying about our relationship to the earth and one another. We journeyed to places over 17,500 feet above sea level. And it is so beautiful there. In those elevations, nothing lives. There's no grass, no vegetation, no algae in the water. There's the sky and the earth and you and God, and I believe this may be why perhaps so many revelations come to us at these high elevations, because the diversions are absent. All that's there is us. We met the most amazing people. We met a woman that walked out of a yak-haired tent at 15,000 feet above sea level, and she said through the translators, she asked us, she says, do you know how precious this time in our history is? Do you know about the great change? Because in her traditions, the Kali Yuga is very close to an end. And what happens after that, we're creating right now. She knows this. Our traditions, Western traditions, when I say ours, in many instances, have forgotten these traditions. We met with some of the most beautiful nuns in the nunneries, monks in the monasteries, each preserving a lineage of wisdom. And in each case, we asked a question time and time again. And it was very near the end of the journey at one particular monastery, I asked the question that's the crux of what we're doing here this evening. This one particular monastery, we had the opportunity to meet with the abbot of this monastery, and I asked him this question. I said, when we sit among you in the chanting halls, and we hear your prayers, we hear your toning in your ohms, in your ohms, in your ums, in your mantras, in your mudras, in your chimes and bells and bowls and gongs, in the incense for 14 and 18 hours a day, on the outside, I said, what happens to you on the inside? This is something you can't get from an ancient text. What happens to you on the inside? And this abbot smiled. He didn't really laugh at me, but he kind of chuckled. Maybe he laughed at me a little bit. Kind of like that. He smiled and he said, you've never seen our prayers because a prayer cannot be seen. He said, what you have seen is what we do to create the feeling in our bodies. And the feeling is the prayer. Then he turned it around on me as the leader of our group. He said, how do you do it in your culture? And what I began to understand was that when we lost those texts 1,700 years ago, we began to believe that if we say the right words, the right number of times, the right moment that we've said the prayer, and while there may be prayers that work well this way, we also know that there are modalities of prayer that are beyond the words. They're based in the power of human feeling that we lost 1,700 years ago. We asked him about his libraries. He said, do you have ancient records, ancient texts that we could look at? And to make a long story very brief, he said yes, and he was happy to show them to us because of a friendship and a camaraderie that had developed. We were led down a series of hallways with 30-foot tall Buddhas of compassion on either side into a darkened room, and all we could see was through the flicker of yak butter candles. And we began to see row after row after row of text after text after text, and we opened them. To the translator, I said, ask him what's in these texts. And he said, everything. And I said, what do you mean, everything? And he said, we have a record of every spiritual tradition that has ever come to this place, and we keep them here. And he said, in many cases, we live them right now. It's very possible that what we see these Tibetan monks doing is actually stemming from the remnants at the basis of our own spiritual beliefs and traditions that were lost, and they have them where we had forgotten. The key is that feeling is the prayer. What we know is that prayer researchers today identify 4 modes of prayer. We call them informal or colloquial prayer, petitionary prayer, ritualistic prayer, and some forms of meditative prayer. And prayer is a very personal word, and it may not be the best word to use to describe what's happening here. And as good as all of these are, what we know is that there is an inner technology that may not fit into these categories, that there is a 5th mode of feeling-based prayer. And I'm going to share this with you now, and then I'd like for you to see, to witness. And if you cannot see this video, I will narrate what is about to happen on the video. It's a prayer that's based in feeling the feeling as if the prayer were already answered, rather than asking through the thoughts that the answer come to pass. Feeling the feeling as if the prayer has already been answered. The Essene Gospel of Peace, one of the texts that was edited, reminds us when our thoughts, body, and feeling become one, then you say to the mountain, mountain move. And the mountain moves. And this may begin to help us understand what this is all about. I'd like to share a brief story to help illustrate this concept, because stories are powerful. In the early 1990s, I was living in northern New Mexico, and a Native American friend of mine invited me to join him for a prayer of rain. That's going to be important in just a moment. During one of the worst droughts in the history of the American desert Southwest. I went with my friend. We met at a predetermined location. We went across several 100,000 acres of very fragrant, high desert sage, and we came to a place that was so ancient, even his ancestors didn't know who put this place here. And here's the key. He said, this place is where the skin between the worlds is very thin. And many possibilities. I was not prepared. I had an expectation of what I thought would happen. I wasn't prepared for what I saw. My friend removed his Kmart work boots, stepped barefooted into this circle. He honored all of his ancestors, all of those who had come before him. He closed his eyes.